Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Two German shepherds found a boy tied up in the mountains. Their action made the whole country weep. The Rocky Mountains, in northern Utah, are beautiful and wild. Their majesty commands silence. When dawn touches the peaks, a veil of mist descends between the pines like a slow, ancestral, almost sacred breath. The wind insinuates itself between the gnarled trunks, and sometimes, the cry of a hawk cleaves the air like a solitary prayer. There, man does not reign. He observes. He learns to be silent. It was in this expanse of pine trees, cliffs, and cold rivers that a man had disappeared from the world for several years, James McAllister, a former U.S. Army sergeant, decorated for bravery but eaten away inside. He had known the conflicts of Afghanistan, the fear that clings to his bones, the goodbyes that never returned. But it wasn't the war that broke him. It was the silent disease of Emily, his wife, taken away in less than 6 months by pancreatic cancer. Since that day, James had not really returned to the living. He had retired to Asmal wooden chalet, nestled on the mountainside, an hour's walk from the nearest village. There, surrounded by trees and memories, he had built a new routine, Spartan but soothing. No signal, no noise. Just the fire in the fireplace, the old photos hanging on the walls, and the warm breath of his two faithful companions. Ranger and officer, two German shepherds with intelligent eyes and glossy coats, were more than animals. They were the last witnesses to his humanity. James had adopted them after their discharge from the military K-9 unit. They, too, had experienced war. They bore the same invisible scars. A silent trust bound them together. A loyalty without words. That morning, like every morning, James woke to the sound of the wind in the trees. He lit the stove, poured some black coffee into his old, chipped mug, and sat down on his cedarwood rocking chair, worn by time. Before him, the mist danced between the trunks like a moving veil. Luna was still asleep by the fireplace, while Ranger was already watching the window, his snout twitching. James quietly opened the door. "Come on, artists, it's time for your round," he murmured. The two dogs bounded out, sniffing the fresh air. Ranger immediately went down to the woods. Luna followed him more deliberately. James stood in the doorway, watching thoughtfully. He raised his cup to his lips, savoring the silence. Here, no cars. No radio. Just the breathing of the world. But suddenly the calm was broken. A low, tense, almost alarming bark echoed through the trees, "Ranger." Then a second, higher-pitched one, almost a scream. "Luna." James immediately sat up. It wasn't Noda hunting or game bark. It was a signal. A call. An alert. He put down his cup, grabbed his old wool-lined military jacket, slipped his knife into his belt, then took Hessian-carved walking stick, the one he had carved after Emily's death, during his long solitary walks. Her heart sped up slightly. No panic, but acute intuition, forged on the battlefields, something was happening. He followed the fresh prints left in the damp earth by his dog's paws. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, but today every rustle seemed charged with a new tension. James pushed aside the last spruce branches and arrived at the edge of Asmal clearing, carpeted with pine needles and damp moss. Light barely pierced through the tall fir trees, casting slanted rays into the still air. An eerie silence reigned, as if the world were holding its breath. And then he saw it. Between two massive trees, almost swallowed by the shade and the bark, was a little boy, without movement. He was tied to a tree trunk, his arms pulled back, cruelly bound by a blue nylon rope, too tight, leaving red marks on her wrists. He had about 10 years, but his face looked younger because he was so thin. His gray sweatshirt was torn, covered in dried mud, resin, and dried blood at the elbows. His jogging pants were barely fitting, frayed, and his shoes were too big for him. Her cheeks were hollow, almost translucent, her pale skin, marbled with cold, her chapped lips were bleeding slightly. His eyes, wide open, were empty. Empty of tears. Empty of hope. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't even shaking anymore. He seemed on the verge of breaking, as if his spirit had already begun to float away from his body. But he was breathing. And he wasn't alone. Officer, sweet Luna, was laying next to him, curled up against his leg. She had rested her head on the boy's thigh, as if to tell him he was no longer alone. Her dark gaze scanned James through the shadows. There was no panic in her eyes, only assolant solemnity, almost human. She was watching. Ranger, he remained standing, his nose raised, his ears pricked. He barked in short bursts, clear, precise, as if he were signaling to James, "Here. Now. Hurry." James heard a blow to the stomach, a dull, icy anger, mixed with a deep shock and immense pity. "My God!" he murmured, his voice strangled. He approached slowly, his hands clearly visible, as if to avoid frightening the child. He knelt in the moss, took out his pocket knife, and gently cut the rope. Each knot seemed to have been tied cruelly, tightened mercilessly. The boy's wrists, once freed, fell limply back onto his knees. James took off his jacket, a lined military parka, and wrapped it around himself without hesitation. The boy's body was ice, his breath barely audible. James felt a lump form in his throat. He took out his metal flask, slowly unscrewed the cap, and raised it to his lips. "Easy, just a sip." The boy barely trembled, took a sip, then looked up. His pupils were dilated, lost, but alive. "My name is James," he said in a firm but gentle voice. "You're safe now, little one. Can you tell me your name?" A silence. Then, in a hoarse, almost inaudible breath, "Ethan. Ethan Moore." James nodded, as if to engrave the name into his memory. "You're strong, Ethan. You held on. I'm going to call for help, okay? We'll take care of you. You don't have to be afraid anymore." He picked up his satellite phone, the only connection to the outside world in these mountains, and dialed 911, his hands trembling slightly. His voice became more military, more efficient, as he transmitted the GPS coordinates. 35 minutes later, a rescue helicopter split the sky, sending pine needles and dead leaves flying. Rescuers rappelled down, followed by 2 social workers and an emergency room doctor. Ethan was taken care of with extreme caution, his vital signs were low. He was immediately put on N4 drip, wrapped in a thermal blanket, and airlifted to Salt Lake City Hospital. Before leaving, the doctor addressed James. "You saved his life. But without your dogs, he wouldn't have lasted another night. He was severely hypothermic. Dehydrated. He hadn't eaten for at least 3 days. He wouldn't have stayed conscious for more than 2 hours." James looked at Luna and Ranger. Ranger sat down, tongue hanging out, as if satisfied with his mission. Luna, on the other hand, was still staring at the departing helicopter, her ears pricked, as if a part of her was leaving with the child. James murmured, more to himself than to the others. "It wasn't my dogs who followed me into the war. It's me who follows them now." What investigators uncovered in the hours after the rescue shocked the entire country. Ethan Moore, 10 years old, had been missing 4 days earlier in the city of Ogden, north of Salt Lake City. His mother, Monica Moore, had called the authorities in a panic, saying her son had run away after an argument. She described him as unstable and prone to oppositional outbursts. The police initially classified the case as a potential runaway, triggering a light search, without much urgency. But an inspector from the youth unit, Sandra Blake, who was already familiar with the family file, insisted this was not the first time that a report had concerned the Moore Benson home. Something was wrong. When Ethan was found, exhausted, hungry, hypothermic, the alert turned into a criminal case. The child, in a weak but lucid breath, spoke simple words to the doctors and social workers. "It was Kyle who left me there. He told me to think about my stupidity." Kyle Benson, Monica's companion, was arrested a few hours later. A former security guard in a logistics warehouse, he had a discreet but disturbing locker, domestic violence, intimidation, threats, without firm convictions. He had managed, until now, to slip through the net. This time, he could no longer run away from the truth. During his interrogation, Kyle first tried to deny it. Then he mentioned a miscalculated punishment. "He pissed me off. He broke my grandmother's vase. He doesn't care about anything, that kid." He had to understand. He showed no remorse. Investigators discovered in his garage the blue rope identical to the one found on Ethan. His vehicle's GPS showed an extended stop in the forest area 2 days earlier. He had took out his phone before going there, thinking he would be untraceable. But he had left digital traces, and worse, he had premeditated the act. The Utah Attorney General said in a press conference that Kyle Benson is reportedly facing charges of aggravated kidnapping, endangering the life of a minor, child abuse, and attempted manslaughter. When the details were made public, the whole country reacts with horror and indignation. The story was no longer that of a simple missing boy, but that of a betrayed child, abandoned in nature by the man who was supposed to protect him. The media immediately seized on the story. Television news, talk shows, and online platforms all broadcast the first images of the rescue. An amateur video, taken by a rescuer with a head-mounted camera, showed Officer, lying next to Ethan on the stretcher, gently licking his face while the paramedics settled him in. This image made around the world in a few hours. She became the symbol of protected innocence, of a pure, instinctive and unconditional love. Millions of people were affected. On social media, hashtags exploded. Hashtag #MercyRangerETLuna, hundreds of children's drawings, poems, video montages were shared. Hashtag #JusticeForEthan, a petition was launched to ensure that Kyle Benson receives the maximum sentence. Hashtag Mountain Heroes, to honor the 2 dogs and their owner, James McAllister. One internet user wrote, "When humans fail, it's animals who remind us what love means. Thank you, Luna. Thank you, Ranger." Public figures expressed their support. The First Lady of the United States issued an official message saluting the courage of a little boy, the loyalty of 2 war dogs, and the vigilance of a forgotten veteran. Veterinarians offered free lifetime follow-up for Luna and Ranger. James McAllister received hundreds of letters, gifts, interview offers, which he politely refused. He said soberly to a television crew waiting for him in front of his chalet, "This isn't a story about heroes. It's a story about instinct." Ranger and Luna did what no adult ever did for that child, they protected him, without expecting anything. After being released from Salt Lake City University Hospital, where he had been treated for hypothermia, dehydration, and post-traumatic stress disorder, Ethan Moore was temporarily placed in foster care. But as soon as investigators confirmed that his maternal aunt, Jessica Moore, registered nurse living in Durango, Colorado, was able and willing to take him in, the judge in charge of the case validated the transfer of custody. Jessica, overwhelmed by what her nephew had endured, created a warm room, full of light and color, with soft blankets and stuffed dog toys. She didn't just want to give him a roof over his head, but a real home. But what Ethan was missing was Ranger and Luna. Every night, in his bed, he drew. Always the same figures, 2 German shepherds. One alert, the other lying beside him. Sometimes he wrote in clumsy letters. "They stayed. They protected me." His psychologists were the first to notice, these dogs were more than just rescuers. They were the thread that had held Ethan to life. When he learned this, James Holloway, Army veteran and owner of Ranger and Luna, hit the road. He loaded his 2 dogs into his battered Ford pickup, drove across 2 states, and arrived one snowy morning at Jessica's house in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. James didn't warn Ethan. He wanted this moment to be real. When Jessica opened the door and Ethan saw Ranger jump out of the trunk, there was not a word. Ethan ran that he almost fell into the snow, then clung to Ranger's neck with feverish strength. Luna, softer, approached slowly and lay down. Ethan slid against her, as he had done under the fir trees in Utah. This time, he was smiling. James stayed for a few days that he told Jessica about the day of the discovery, his dog's instinctive behavior, and his own emotion. Together, they decided that Ranger and Luna would visit Ethan as often as possible. Better yet, James set up an educational program in schools to talk about rescue, resilience, and respect for animals, using Ethan's story as a starting point, with her consent. 3 months later, as Washington, D.C., a large lecture hall at the Department of Homeland Security was packed. Under the American flags fluttering slowly in the air conditioning, the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, in collaboration with the National Animal Hero Foundation, organized an unprecedented ceremony, the presentation of the Animal Courage Medal to 2 retired military dogs. Ranger and Luna took the stage with James. They each wore an engraved medal around their necks. Journalists, veterans, members of Congress, students from visiting schools, all rose to their feet to applaud. In the front row, Ethan, in an oversized suit and badly tied blue tie, watched the scene with tears in his eyes. His Aunt Jessica held his hand. Then James stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, but every word carried. "I have served my country in war zones. I have seen pain, horror, abandonment. But never have I seen an act as pure as that of my dogs that day. There was no order, no promise of reward. They chose. They chose to save a child." He stopped, his throat tight. "And I think it was them, that day, who reminded me what it means to serve." The audience was on its feet. Tears were flowing. Even the most seasoned agents were moved. After the ceremony, a photographer from the Washington Post captured a moment, Ethan, kneeling in his costume, holding Luna's head against his cheek, and Ranger sitting proudly beside him. This photo went around the world. And since that day, every year, in schools in Colorado and Utah, the story of a little boy saved by 2 dogs is told. We are not talking about revenge or hatred. We talk about courage. Of indestructible bonds. And this simple truth: sometimes, heroes have 4 legs. Inspired by this story that had touched the whole country, a vast national project was born, Guardians of Hope. Guardians of Hope. It was a groundbreaking program, supported by FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, and several civilian foundations, that aimed to rehabilitate former military dogs for 2 critical missions: searching for missing people in extreme environments and providing emotional support to children who have experienced profound trauma. The program officially launched in Denver, in a former military training center transformed into a haven for the dogs and young participants. James Walker, a respected veteran and owner of Luna and Ranger, was naturally appointed National Project Director. Humble, but determined, he declared at the inauguration. "Every dog here has experienced war. Every child here has experienced some form of abandonment. Together, they rebuild. And sometimes, they save each other." But the surprise of the day was the nomination d'Ethan Moore, barely 11 years old. Like junior ambassador of the program, he had neither rank nor diploma. But he had something even more precious, a living testimony, a heart repaired by 2 muzzles full of tenderness. A few months later, in Salt Lake City, at a conference at an elementary school serving children who were victims of domestic violence, Ethan took the stage in front of about 100 classmates. He wore a slightly oversized Guardians of Hope t-shirt and held a microphone with a shaky hand. He told his story with simple but powerful words. He explained how, for 4 days, he thought no one would come. He explained the fear, the hunger, the loneliness, but also the moment when 2 shadows emerged from the woods and changed his life. And then he concluded, looking his comrade straight in the eyes. "That day, I thought I was alone in the world. But then 2 dogs came. They found me. And they loved me, like I was their family. So today, I want to do the same. I want to find other children. And tell them, you are not alone. Never again." The audience stood there frozen for a moment. Then a round of applause erupted, followed by silent tears and children coming up to hug him one by one. That day, Ethan was no longer just a survivor. He became a living symbol of hope, resilience, and unconditional love. Because sometimes the greatest heroes have 4 legs, a huge heart, and the courage to cross mountains to save a life.